Ready for part 2? All right, let's get started. So if you have your circular objects that you're going to trace, and I'm going to use a marker so that you can see it better on the paper, but if all you have is a pencil, that'll be great, so just use that. Now as I'm placing my objects, I'm thinking about how I'm arranging them in the piece to create a focal area or to create some center of interest that is a little bit different than everything else. I hope you remember when we talked about composition, how to arrange things, about the rule of thirds. If you split your paper into sections, where those lines intersect are the best places for a focal area or a part of your composition that draws the most attention. The most attention will be drawn to this area right here. You want to avoid things going off the edge of the paper because that pulls the viewer's eye right off into somebody else's work. So these again will be places that you might think about concentrating a focal area. So I'll start with my large object. You can start with any one you want. And may I just suggest that you wait until the whole end of the presentation before you start, because I'll be going over quite a few things. So I'm going to hold that steady and just trace right around that one. And then I'll take another one. This one I'm going to overlap the first one. I could even trace around the outside of my tape, because if you'll notice in Sonia Delani's work, she had what's called concentric circles. Those were circles within circles. So that's an idea that you might like to explore on your design as well. Right now, I've got a large and a medium. It would be wise of me to put a small one. But what would happen if I put the small one right in the middle? I'm afraid that it would draw too much attention to the middle of my composition, so I'm not going to put it there. Let's see, where should I put it? I want to avoid the exact centers of my paper, and that's going along the center, so I'm not really too crazy about that. That's a little bit centered. This might be a nice spot. So I'll trace around this circle, and I'll just continue until I have a nice arrangement of different sizes of circles placed around my composition in what I feel might be an interesting way. You don't need too many of these. Now, something else that might happen as you're working is that you'll have areas of concentration where there's a lot of overlapping. That's also going to draw a lot of attention there, so you might be careful about that too.
I did put this a little bit too centered, but not too distracted by it. I think there'll be other areas that are going to draw more attention. So I'm going to try one more concentric circle there. That's working pretty nicely. You'll notice that I'm leaving a large area blank. You don't have to do that. You could add more if you want, but for me, this works nicely because of the next step. Now, you can also arrange your circles vertically, but the video does better horizontally, so that's why I've done that. Now, if you do have a compass, of course, you do exactly the same thing. Just alter the size of your circle with your compass rather than your marker. So that works great too. The advantage of having a compass also is in Mr. Frank Stella's work, you'll see that occasionally he'll use a half circle instead of a full circle. So again, that's the advantage of you having a compass. If you have one, you could add half circles. Well, I kind of like that. I think I'll do a concentric one right there. All right. Now for me, I would want to outline that so that I could see it better. And now that I have that one, I might need to balance one out. You see, that's the thing about art. You do something and it visually, you feel like, oh, okay, I did that, now I need something else. But I'm going to wait on that until I put my lines in, my straight edge lines, and that may solve my balance problem. Now, I probably would think that these will be balanced asymmetrically, which means one side will not look like exactly the other side, but it will be equal weighted. Right now, my design isn't equal weighted because there's more over here and not a lot here, but I'm going to fix that.
All right, so the next step then is to take your ruler, and again, if you don't have a ruler, you can just use a folded up piece of paper as a straight edge. Anything, a piece of cardboard will do, anything that you have a nice straight edge to make a nice straight line. All right, now again, I'm going to remember my rule of thirds. I'm going to avoid making lines that are equal or right down in the middle. Want to avoid the middle. off to one side or the other side will work best. So I'm going to put one of my lines, again, crossing over my circles. I'm going to overlap them, and I'm putting it low on the page. Avoid the center. I put it low on the page. And I actually like doing a double line. Now when you use a ruler, remember, don't hold it on the edge, that'll move. Make sure when you're doing a line, spread your fingers out on your ruler to hold it, and then draw the line, and that line won't move on you. All right, now something is happening that is working well for me, and that is the negative space, that's the space behind the objects, is starting to look more interesting. Here's an example of what I mean. The A in this design is the positive shape. The white shapes, those are the shapes created behind the A. These are called negative shapes. And both shapes in a design are equally important. It helps you to avoid having floating images. So this line that I just drew helps divide this background or negative space into its own shapes, and that's a good thing. So I've got a horizontal row. I think I'd like to have a vertical row, and again I'm going to avoid the center. Move over here. I think that looks pretty good, but this one I want to vary. Remember, contrast is good. I don't want it to be exactly the same, so this one I'm going to make skinnier. All right. Now, I did mine horizontally and vertically. If you want to draw your lines diagonally, that would be fantastic. But just keep in mind the purpose of the lines is to divide the negative space, that's the space behind your objects, in an interesting way. Just keep that in mind when you're doing that. All right, once you have your drawing done, we can talk about color. All right, we'll go back to the color wheel. The first color scheme that Julian talked about was monochromatic. Monochromatic color scheme, again, is any color on the color wheel, just one, plus its tints and shades. Remember, a tint and a shade is based on how much white or black is added to the color, the value of the color, light or dark. Here's an example of a monochromatic color scheme, just using black and white with mixtures of gray. Here's another one using all blues. That would be a monochromatic color scheme. So if you're going to add color with crayon, you would use a red, a pink, because a pink is a tint of red. Any variation of pink will be great. Now, I was looking through my box to try to find a dark red, like a maroon. I think one is called a brick red. I could not find it. If you can find it, fantastic. But I couldn't. So I actually made my red a little darker just by adding some black crayon to it, and that worked out just fine. So as you can see in this finished monochromatic color scheme with the red crayons, some areas I left very light. Some areas I added dark. And again, this is contrast. It helps the design show up and be more interesting. So every time the line overlapped and created a new shape, that's where I changed the color. Light to dark, dark to light. And that creates, again, each positive shape shows up beautifully, and each negative shape, that's the shape behind the design, also works well. Now, in order to do that, let's go back to something that Mr. House taught you.
And that is, I'm going to use my concentric circle, and that is, I love the way he used to say this, still does, I assume, is that as you're adding color, especially in those small spaces, rather than just start scribbling in the color, he calls it building a fence. I just love that. If you go around the perimeter or the edge of your shape first very slowly, and then fill in the center, it creates a fence to keep all of your color strokes inside the shape that you want. Now, if you want a really rich color, very highly saturated, as Julian would say, you'd want to press really hard with your crayon. Get a lot of pressure on there. And if you're having trouble doing that and keeping it nice and smooth, if you slip some newspaper or a magazine under your paper, it really helps to create that crayon looking a lot smoother. Now, yes, it'd be a lot more fun to paint these, and if we were in the art room, that's what we'd be doing. But this crayon works out just fine. So that's the way to create those nice clean edges when you're adding the color, which is really going to contribute to a nice finished effect. Now, to do the lighter values, of course, you just don't press so hard with your crayon. The other thing, if you have a crayon that doesn't have the paper on it, it's a broken one, use the side of your crayon and just very lightly press. It's not white. It has a little bit of value, but it's really, really light. And that light value next to the darker value just really, really works well. So that's what a monochromatic color scheme would look like. So let's take a look at another one.
Now, before I go any further, if you want to, it might be interesting and fun to actually do two. I'm only going to require you to do one. But if you have time and you want to see how different these color schemes can make a composition look, you can take your drawing that you've done, take another piece of paper, and if you take it up to a window and set it on the window, you'll be able to see the lines right through, and you can trace the exactly same composition and see what it would look like as a monochromatic color scheme or one of the other color schemes. So it's just an idea if you want to try it. Right, so the next color scheme is a complementary color scheme. If you recall from the presentation, a complementary color scheme are any two colors directly opposite each other on the color wheel. So that has to go through the center. So yellow and violet would be complementary, red and green would be complementary, blue and orange would be complementary, yellow, green, and red, violet would be complementary. So if you wanted to use a complementary color scheme on your piece, you would choose your colors. I'm choosing blue and orange. And then any variation of those two, if it's, you can find a darker blue or a lighter blue. And if you use a lighter, like a peach color, anything that makes that color look lighter, same thing. And then again, the amount of pressure you put on your crayon will also determine if it's light or dark. So complementary. The next one would be analogous. And analogous is any three colors next to each other on the color wheel, plus their tints and shades. So I could go blue, blue, violet, and violet, plus any lighter or darker variation of those. I'm going to choose for my analogous, I'm going to choose yellow, yellow, orange, and orange. So I've got this variety for that. That works great. And you're probably saying, but Mrs. Jones, you've got brown in there. What does brown have to do with orange? Brown is actually a shade of orange, because if you had orange paint and you mixed a little black in it, you'd get brown. So brown is a shade. If you have a peach color, or I think they call it apricot, that color would be a tint of orange. So that works good. That works too. So if I have my drawing, again, everywhere where that line overlaps, that's where you would change the color. And here's where building the fence really comes
In handy, so thanks, Mr. House. Those little spaces to try to keep that color within that space. And it looks really neat, again, if you put a dark next to a light. Oops, crayon broke. A dark next to a light, build your fence so it's nice and smooth. Because really, how well you add the color, your craftsmanship, is really going to determine whether these are going to work beautifully for you or not. So take your time with your coloring. All right, our last
one then.
Your last choice is called the triadic color scheme. The triadic color scheme, as Julian pointed out, are colors equidistant from each other. So you can tell yellow, red, and blue are actually, not only are they primary, but that's a triadic color scheme. So if you pick a color, skip three colors, pick that color, skip three colors, and pick that color, that's a triadic color scheme. So red, yellow, blue. This is orange, green, and violet would be a triadic color scheme. And once again, you use the tints and shades of those colors to do your project. So, I hope you enjoy the process. Complementary, just choose one of your color schemes. Add color to your geometric design, paying attention to the negative space. Good craftsmanship. And I hope you'll enjoy that.
And don't forget to send your teacher a photograph of your finished piece. Be sure to identify which color scheme you used.